Today, we're extremely excited to have the Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture as one of the case studies and presenting their work today. They work particularly with smallholders in a variety of countries in the global south, which they'll tell you about. And I think this is a particularly interesting case for a few reasons. First of all, they've really, thanks to the leadership of Simon Winter, who's been their executive director for several years, put scaling at the center of their work. They are committed to seeing that there are innovations that are sustainable and help smallholder go to scale in a sustainable way. And they really worked hard to integrate this into their organizational culture, the way they design and projects, their work programs, their overall strategy. And at the same time, interestingly enough, they have made less progress, I think, in formal tools like scaling frameworks or how criteria guidelines. So they've particularly made an emphasis on partnerships and how to create what they call transformational partnerships, as opposed to, I think, what has been the standard practice in international development of transactional partnerships, which are limited in terms of time and scope and goals. So with what I hope are those tasty foreshadowing of the wonderful things we're about to hear from them, I will turn it over to them. So thank you so much for everybody who's come. And Simon and company, please, Karen, please go ahead, and I'll let you, Simon, and your colleagues introduce yourselves.
Great. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for having me. I'll kick us off. So I'm Karen Holzman. I'm a consultant, and I, along with my colleague Ken Boyce, were contacted in the summer of 2023 by Simon who is commissioning this case study. And we did this in pretty short order. So in September 2023, we had about 4 weeks to pull this off. And we did it through speaking with about 20 people. That included staff from Switzerland and in-country. We spoke with some board members, the former CEO, and some external partners using a semi-structured interview format and really trying to embrace the outline that the community of practice had handed to us. We also did a review of documents, not that many documents, but enough to kind of give us some perspective. And Ken and I both have a background in terms of private sector engagement and development. So we were bringing that experience and that lens in as well, particularly in the agri and food sectors. We workshopped some of the findings internally with some of the senior staff, but we didn't go through any type of validation or triangulation exercise. But what we found was a fairly consistent narrative, an organization very introspective and willing to look at things. And we really also tried to disaggregate the idea of scaling versus the mainstreaming of scaling. And with that background, I'm going to hand it over to Simon, who's going to open up the session and share with us some of his reflections.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Richard. Great to be with everybody today. So when I became the executive director of Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture in the second half of 2017, on the first day I arrived at our foundation, my predecessor and the team had organized a conference on scaling. And so I was not the initiator of scaling at our foundation. This was already a narrative that Marco Ferroni and the team had brought into the foundation prior to my joining. What I did find, however, was there was a hypothesis at that point that scaling innovations meant developing a proof of concept and then handing this over to market players to do the scaling. And it was purely that handover of a very robust concept with robust evidence of the benefits to farmers, the benefits to the intellectual property owners, the innovators, and potentially investors and financiers, and that would be enough. That evidence would be enough to catalyze scaling. And my own experience from working at Technoserve for 14 years before was that trying to scale in unsophisticated and underserved and weak market systems required rather more intense and comprehensive support than purely the proof of concept. I'm simplifying, of course. So we went through, by 2019, we went through a reflective learning exercise, which Richard actually helped us with as part of the journey. And we really focused on bringing systems thinking more comprehensively into our strategic framework and how to drive action out of that systems thinking. Starting with what do farmers need, and separating a little bit what farmers want and what farmers need, because often farmers will express their needs in terms of what they know, what they're aware of, but they're often not aware of the innovations that can help them. So bringing the science part in alongside what one's hearing from the farmers themselves, and then putting that together starts to create the basis for what the innovation gaps are and how the scaling could proceed. And then developing robust scaling pathways, recognizing that, purely the proof of concept, necessary as it is, and often missing as it is when research is coming out of public innovators from universities and research centers and so on, that proof of concept needs then curation and catalyzing into adoption and then scaling of that adoption. So that was the philosophy that we brought on board. We then ran that past our board. We had multiple workshops with our board, and we landed on this concept of catalytic intermediaries then as the, let's say, institutional mechanism that would enable scaling to happen in practice. And as Richard said in his introduction, part of the scaling process then is to figure out what are the innovations, and not only what's the scaling pathway for those innovations, but who are then the partners that are going to accompany you on that pathway as you go through the proof of concept process, you go through the development of the catalytic intermediary, and you go into scaling. And I'm very pleased that we're joined in this webinar by three people who are going to be commentating on their roles as they've accompanied us in different ways. So just to frame that, one of our scaling areas has been on seeds and the commercialization of publicly bred seeds. And we've been accompanied on that journey for a long period by USAID, and Mark Heisinger in particular has been a champion of that. So we'll hear from Mark in a little while around his experience of working with us as we've sought to not only scale in seeds, but really embed scaling as an institutional pillar and a strategic pillar for us. We've also been aggressive about scaling our first mile and last mile entrepreneurial business solutions, and in particular over the last few years in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, how to do that with women entrepreneurs. And we're joined by the program director for that program from our India affiliate, and Anita Govindaraj, and we'll hear from her a bit later. And then we're also very pleased to be making sure that we are scaling in partnership as much as possible with the private sector. There's really, and you'll read this, those of you who haven't yet read some of the materials in the Scaling Community of Practice, you'll read this in the documents, that at the end of the day, the development process is really a trigger and a catalyst. It's not going to scale everything continually through just larger scale development programs. At some point, the private sector or the public sector, or some combination thereof, needs to take over and embed the scaling into their local market systems. And one of the key players for us in Bangladesh has been Raj from Sheba Enterprises, and Raj is with us today as well. Thank you, Raj, for joining. And Raj has also been working with us on this agri-entrepreneurs, or in Bangladesh, we call them the Farmers Hubs model, as a scaling partner. So these transformational partners who go on the journey with you, evolve with you, learn with you, and deploy with you are critical. And so there's a characteristic there, which is, I would call, stickiness, that this is not just a traditional development project for 3 years or 4 years or whatever the duration that a foundation or a bilateral or multilateral development funder wants to see. This has to be about phased approach, and we've introduced internally a stage gate process where you go from the original understanding of needs and testing and trialing of innovations to meet those needs, to developing the proof of concept, to getting that embedded into the business model, and then taking that to scale through the private sector or through the public sector. And that also requires people. So the long-serving stickiness is not only stickiness in terms of these transformational partners, but it's also about long-serving staff. And we've been very fortunate at our foundation to have staff who've been around much longer than I've been around at the foundation, about 7 years now. I found most of our current staff when I arrived, and many of them are still there. And what we've supported and has been a characteristic, I think, is then empowerment of those staff to lead in terms of the local market system. So we're not directing everything from headquarters. We're helping to catalyze things from headquarters, but really empowering the local staff to do then adaptation to the local context, so that the scaling happens in that local context, and we train and support appropriately. We also introduced more robust and comprehensive monitoring and evaluation systems, including bringing in consistent external evaluation partners. We worked a lot with 60 decibels, for example, across different countries to run surveys to make sure that the impact was happening on the entrepreneurs, the impact was happening on the farmers. And then where needed, we also worked on broader enabling environment issues and made the policy work and the enabling environment work a critical piece of our approach as well. And I think there, just to go back, for example, on the seed side, with USAID support, we worked with New Markets Lab on a range of programmatic work across the African seed systems to make sure that we were strengthening those local seed systems, so registrations and commercialization and licensing and trade in seeds could happen more easily. And then more recently, we've been doing a lot of policy work as one of our, let's say, new innovation areas, which has been really around regenerative agriculture and climate smart agriculture. And we've been doing policy work on that in Bangladesh, in Kenya, and Indonesia, in partnership with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, World Vision, and the ODI and IDS out of the UK. So again, always in partnership, even as we tackle the policy and enabling environment challenges. So maybe I'll just pause there, Karen, and hopefully that's given sufficient sort of flavor to the background, and then hand over back to you to give some of your reflective lessons. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to build on some of what Simon said, and also to not repeat everything that is in the report, because there's a lot of good content in the report, but actually to kind of bring some observations that sit between the lines in the report. One thing that really struck me about this organization, first of all, we need to be clear about what this organization is, which is it's both a foundation and an implementing partner. And that makes it very unique in the space. So it doesn't kind of sit clearly in the funder camp, and it doesn't sit completely in the implementer camp. And that ability to play on both of those roles and those skill sets makes this a very unique organization. But also what I found very unique about this organization was the lack of ego. So knowing that it was never going to have the potential to do it all itself, that it needed, if it was ever going to scale something, to have that work outside of its own walls, and knowing that handoffs were inevitable and the obvious way that things would be scaling, and that catalytic intermediaries were going to be essential to the work. It kind of put the ego to the side. So it's not an organization that leads with its brand or leads with that ownership of the solution. And that allowed the organization to be very demand-led in terms of how it looked at scaling, and really driven by impact, and driven also by that success of seeing it in the market, not seeing its brand on the scaling solution. And I found that quite remarkable in contrast to other organizations that I've seen in the space. And that whole idea of the handing off and not just handing it off once they had done proof of concept, but that switch that Simon had talked about meant that all of that thinking was done really early or needed to be done early. And there were lessons learned when it was being done a little bit too late. And also that recognition on those handoffs that there was never going to be necessarily the perfect partner, or the perfect intermediary. And so that there was going to be a lot of capacity building along that journey and a lot of shared learnings and adjustments. And so that clarity of the journey became really clear early because of that acknowledgement that handing off was going to be a part of that solution. I also just wanted to throw out this quote that sits in the paper that I love and reread quite frequently, which is, "Scaling requires sustainable solutions, and sustainable solutions requires scaling." And the fact that that kind of was a mantra in the organization was a really good starting point for making sure that mainstreaming scaling was sitting at the heart and the mind of everyone that we spoke with. Another thing that we identified as a good characteristic for mainstreaming scaling was focus. So fewer distractions, that deep technical expertise that was built up, as well as the clarity about the role that they were playing. So what was Syngenta Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture bringing to the table? It was that deep technical expertise. It was that research capability. It was that leverage and those networks and those willing to be that problem solver, but with that deep focus on their critical verticals. And I think that also really helped to not just be chasing the fancy shiny object that was in front of them or the new opportunity that was knocking on the door. And I think that long-term sustained commitment to solving the problems in those three key verticals really helped on the mainstreaming side. I would say also, I mean, it's not all perfect. I'm highlighting some of the amazing things. I think it was quite interesting hearing when you're talking about really trying to create this entrepreneurial culture, about how you could try and really lobby, or people became really entrenched with the particular project or idea that they were working on. And even though it might be time to let go because the scaling opportunity wasn't there, that willingness to tinker a little bit more, to get a little bit more runway, and to kind of bring people along with that was something that I found quite interesting and quite persuasive as to where does the subjectivity and then the objectivity sit in that culture. And when you're trying to make decisions with limited resources and you want the greatest scaling opportunity, how does that subjectivity and that objectivity have to kind of be in balance? Let me see, I have a couple more things and then I'm going to turn it over to a discussion with Simon. But just to say, there's a culture of systems thinking in the organization. I think that really helps in terms of mainstreaming scaling. Market systems for development is something that a lot of people kind of had as a skill set and a toolkit. And so that systems thinking, I think, really did help in terms of that conversation and that framing about thinking about scale, about thinking about networks, partnerships, policy, environment. And then the final thought before I turn it over to a discussion with Simon is monitoring and evaluation and learning. So that whole idea of an evidence base and how critical is that evidence base, especially when you're working with government, but also definitely with the private sector. How much do you need to kind of build that in? And is that a critical element to mainstreaming scaling, or does that then become a cost center? And that's a question I'll pose to Simon in a second. So Simon, just any high-level reflections on what I've just shared before I fire off a few questions and discussion points to you.
Thank you, Karen. No, appreciate it. I think your point about the lack of ego is an important point, and it goes hand in hand actually with that knowledge that what we're trying to scale here is not our project or our program; it's the outcomes of that and the impacts of that. And as you said, that at the beginning, knowing that that will only happen through the private sector mostly is our predisposition, or potentially through the public sector, makes one humble. Because you're in service then of those institutions, not trying to promote your own brand and so on. And I think your point about staying too long on projects definitely resonates. I remember one thing I didn't highlight in my description is we did introduce a number of tools to support the management of the stage gates and the management of the allocation of our scarce resources and so on. One in particular was a fairly robust approach to portfolio management brought in by an expert from Syngenta, the company. Actually, we often would bring in company experts in research or business development or other aspects of agricultural management, and the introduction of portfolio management really helped us get a grip on where were we spending money, what was the result of that spending, how far advanced were the innovations, and so on. And yet, even despite that, with a culture then of empowerment internally and on entrepreneurship internally, people did want to hold on to their pet projects. And it was very difficult to kill things that really weren't scaling. I remember one particular case was our insurance work in Indonesia, which despite several years of tweaking and adjusting and so on, was remaining not scaling. And I think it took something like 3 years to finally stop, doing that work. Whereas we probably should have stopped it after the first year of realizing it wasn't going very far. So very, very good observations, Karen. Thank you.
And so just to unpick that just a little bit, I mean, in terms of leadership and setting the organizational culture, how did you navigate the flexibility versus rigidity, the entrepreneurial spirit, but the discipline? What was your thought in terms of how do you kind of disseminate that organizationally?
I would say it was a fairly organic process of engagement between our, let's say, science experts and innovation experts centrally, and as well as locally across the countries. And then this portfolio management process to try and then bring the objectivity into looking at the data and looking at the analytics. And it varied. It varied by character as much as anything to do with, let's say, more institutional factors. Some people are just naturally more aggressive and entrepreneurial or entrepreneurial than others. And I think you can't mandate that. I mean, if you're too top down and too like, no, we're going to be super rigid about this, you may lose some of that spirit of entrepreneurship, which is so important to do the scaling in the local context. And at the same time, if you're too loosey-goosey, then you don't have this opportunity to have a more systematic approach. So did we get it right? No, I think we were probably too loose on that overall. But I think we see, the results in the sense that many of the things we've started have been scaling fairly successfully.
And one thing we were really taken with was how impressive and empowered the local staff and the local programming was. How do you kind of manage that centralization versus decentralization question, especially as a funder in Switzerland where there's lots of rules and regimens?
So, this is a bit maybe too much inside the institution piece, but this is mainstreaming, so it's about the inside the institution piece. So the portfolio management had two aspects to it. One was an annual planning cycle. And as we went through the annual planning cycle, it was up to the countries to say these were we called them portfolio items or PIs. These were the PIs they wanted to progress with. This was the rationale. They had to put that in an annual plan. They had to, in other words, make a business case as to why they needed to allocate resources to the various things that they were working on at the various stages of scaling. And then we did a comprehensive review across the entire portfolio to say, right, we have so many resources, the demands are 50% more or 100% more than the resources we have available. So how do we then prioritize those portfolio items based on where we think the highest potential for scaling and for impact is? And so we would then draw a waterline, and some things would not get funded and supported, and other things would. But we didn't micromanage that centrally. Once that plan was agreed, and once that budget allocation to a particular country or region was agreed, then it was up to the local team to then manage the spend. So we would then be a grant maker at that point to the local institution. Of course, the local institution would have to report back to us on how they were making progress, but they were then empowered at that point to spend the money. And that kind of tag teaming in a way through the sort of planning process and then the management process, I think was a fairly reasonable way for us to manage that duality that you're alluding to.
And pretty revolutionary, I would say, compared to other organizations I've seen. Last question, and then I'll turn it over to some other speakers, is one of the things we were a little bit critical about was the use of the word partnerships, because everyone was a partner and we were trying to figure out, okay, what's the differential between partners and how do you manage partners? And the language of transactional versus transformational or relational partners started coming into the narrative. So I love your kind of retrospective thinking in terms of what is that partner language and what is truly transformational in terms of partnerships, and what's the lesson learned for others in that.
Yeah, I think that was a super reflection of yours and Ken's, Karen, to make that separation. And I alluded a bit to that in my introduction, but let me pull that out a little more and expand on it. So I think there are going to be, let's say, visionary partners who really share that sense of what is the long-term transformation that's needed, and how do they play that role as a transformational partner. In other words, writing out the cycle, not just doing, a traditional 3-year or 5-year development program, but seeing it as a series of initiatives that may be attached to different phases of the scaling. So it may be that, there's a project for, let's say, the proof of concept. But if that project is then successful, there will be another project that is the, let's say, business development and getting the transactions to support that business development activity going. And then another project maybe that's around the handoff. And we thought about that internally as well. We never got as far, frankly, even despite the fact we've been running the portfolio management system for about 3.5 years now. We didn't get as far as I would have liked in terms of being more objective, back to your earlier point about, a bit more ruthless management of that. I would have liked to have gone to that further, but the transformational partners ride that journey with you. And that's scarce in development. It's really hard to find those. We've had great success. I mean, our longest project has been running for 17 years. Now, it's not one project that's been running for 17 years. It's gone through multiple phases. This is about breeding and then commercializing improved teff varieties for Ethiopia. But it's taken that length of time to really get to the point where we now have multiple breeds of improved varieties that can be processed, can be mechanized, and so on, and can withstand the climate ravages that are facing Ethiopia, that are now getting commercialized in the local market systems. It wouldn't have happened if we hadn't stuck with it for that length of time. And so this would be one of my big recommendations to the development community more generally. It's actually something I've been recommending for years, but with a bit more evidence now, is to say, if you really want to commit to transformation, you've got to commit to the long term. And then there are the you as consultants, as advisors, as business development service providers, as financial partners, and so on, to enable those different stages to happen.
Great. I think we're going to hear from some other people now. So thanks for that, Simon. Thanks for answering all my questions.
Richard, do you want to come in and ask the questions to our next speakers, or how do you want to do this at this point?
I thought you were going to have your commentators comment, but I do have a couple of questions that are perhaps germane by now. And also, actually, even though it's highly unorthodox, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think are quite appropriate now. So first of all, I guess we are fortunate, I think, to have with us John Gargani, who wrote a very important book on scaling a few years ago in partnership with some people from IDRC about responsible scaling or optimal scaling, which talks about how do you define scaling. And his question is particularly that scaling can't just be about reaching more people, but also has to balance other objectives, such as its unintended consequences, its implications for inequalities, marginalization, gender discrepancies, etc. So his question was, how are you suggesting that scaling depends on markets in agriculture or in your particular work, or what agricultural impacts don't scale through markets? So I think, there's sort of a social justice equity trade-off question here about the role of markets and why you've emphasized markets and where markets work and where don't, and what are the implications of that?
So I do want to hear from our guests, Richard, first. So maybe
okay, fine. I'm
could
sorry.
I ask that we come back to John's very interesting question a bit later? So let me do the introduction to our guests. Let's have Anita go first, because it's Diwali today, and Anita is joining, and I think has guests to celebrate Diwali with. So Anita, thank you very much for taking time on a holiday day to be with us. The first question for you is, as a staff member and a colleague, how have you experienced our efforts, let's say more in the periphery of the organization versus the center of the organization? Does what Karen and I have been talking about, does that sound familiar to you? And do you have any comments, on any particular nuances as you tried to lead a scaling initiative on our behalf in India, and then maybe also some reflections on lessons learned and improvement areas?
Yeah. Thank you, Simon, and thanks for the Diwali wishes. You all have to excuse me for the background noise. India is celebrating with crackers Diwali. So you all have to excuse me. As like this discussion, I really found it interesting. As far as scaling is concerned, I feel Syngenta Foundation India has already mandated into our organizational objectives, and fairly we were successful also. I think in the case study also it was mentioned that in 2014 we just had 25 entrepreneurs, and 2018 we had 250 entrepreneurs. So I think as of now I can proudly say we have a huge network of more than 20,000 entrepreneurs connected with 2.1 million farmers across 13 states. So this is a huge achievement, and the major credit goes to our associate. I would assign the credit majorly to our association with SRLMs, like State Rural Livelihood Mission. I hope you all know this is a Department of Rural Development. So somehow I feel to reach to some scale, our partnerships and networking plays a huge role. So we need to explore how we can leverage the large networks already existing, rather than going and finding out the new options. So in this, before initiating further points, I would I didn't even introduce myself. I head a large program of Agri-Entrepreneur Growth Foundation. We are working in India. We work across 13 states, and I head the program on 10,000 Women Entrepreneur Program funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which we are implementing in partnerships with SRLMs of Bihar and Madhya Pradesh government. So this was to increase from 250 entrepreneurs to 20,000 entrepreneurs, of course, in 4 years, in just 4 years from and we also passed through difficult times of COVID. but somehow our team had been successful in like adjusting ourselves to quickly correcting ourselves to the changing challenges. Actually, we really had huge challenges which we didn't foresee while we started the program, since this was our this was to be implemented in association with the government public institution. Things were not easy for us, and things were different across the geographies also. We had lot of learnings which is now helpful in our upcoming projects and programs also, which we are continuously iterating and imbibing the learnings in the previous programs into our later strategies also. So what I feel as a scaling strategy should be like it should be inbuilt into our organization objectives. And SFI, Syngenta Foundation India has been quite successful in that. And we could, with this Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation project, we could do gender mainstreaming also. As of now, among the 20,000 entrepreneurs, more than 53% are women entrepreneurs. And in that, COVID has been turned into a boom for us, because we quickly adjusted our training model into a hybrid model as online. We made it into online, which invited many women participants also. So this is quite a good learning for us. So now, because of that, even women like in the rural areas, now they're coming forward, look like they're approaching us like we want to become the entrepreneurs. So this is a good sign of our model. So what I feel is when we achieve some scale, minimum scale, then the multiplier effect automatically starts, and so many organizations, they themselves approach us and they want to adopt our model. That's a good sign. So hence, to get visibility, we need to have achieve some scale. For that, we had to have a focused approach key and the long-term goal also. Like we should have by 2030, where should we be? 2040, where should we be? And so we already, our organization have already a goal of achieving 100K entrepreneurs by 2030. Maybe we are very over ambitious, but we are trying our best with. And it's an interesting thing that more and more organizations are now identifying our model as an effective model, and they are coming to us and they want to scale the model also. This is a good development. And I agree with Simon that we have to invest more in monitoring and evaluation studies. We also did a good study with 60 decibels and Satwa program, Satwa Indian organization. So the results have been very good. The monitoring and evaluation results have been very good, and which is also helping us in getting good feedback among the funding organizations. So like now, as a scale, I may be overshooting my time. So what we are having in mind is, like, now there are 100 million SHG women members across India, and the government is also now struggling to get their economic activity, to get them into profitable economic activities. Now they are just operating in the savings mode. So that's we have in our mind how to get our model like adopted at the government level, so that across SHGs, every SHG member can be made an agriculture entrepreneur, rural entrepreneur. This is our approach for the scaling up, as a scaling up strategy. And another one, like there was another question, like
Anita, I think we're going to have to wrap up, but if you could just say a couple of final comments, that would be great. Thank you.
One last comment. I would say when we adopt a scaling strategy, we need to have a plan for team building exercises also, because suddenly when we scale up somewhere, we find we are not ready for such a huge program. So we have to have plan for capacity building of the team and team strengthening. This is my final point.
Great. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining on Diwali. Happy Diwali.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Let's go to Raj now. Raj, maybe you can explain how a little bit how you have been a scaling partner of ours. You're a market player, of course. You're not a part of our staff or our team, and so in a sense, we've handed it off to you. And I think it would be great to get some reflections from you on, how working with us institutionally, not just on the specific innovation, but working with us institutionally as a transformational partner. How has that experience been for you? And Raj, you're on mute at the moment. We're not hearing you or seeing you for that matter.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very, very much for the introduction. Thank you, Karen, for your nice presentation. So nice. And Anita also, nice clips of the Indian market, Indian activities. Basically, how we got involved with Syngenta Foundation is we started working with Syngenta Foundation since 2014, because we work for a multinational company as their supply chain management partner for a food giant Kellogg's in Bangladesh, and so we tried to source potato in the sector of potato. So before that, let me introduce myself. My name is Raj, Kazi Borhan Amin Raj. So I'm the managing director and CEO of Seba Agrotech and Sales Limited. It's an input producer and seller. We grow seed, micronutrients, and also organic fertilizers. That's what we do. And also we have a huge contract farming operation in Bangladesh. We basically grow processing grade potatoes through our contract farmers and our partner organizations for a multinational company. So in 2014, when we started working with the potato flakes processor, we started looking for good partners who can help us. Then we got introduced with Syngenta Foundation Bangladesh, Sustainable Bangladesh, and we see this model, the farmer sub model there, and we engaged with this one of the farmers hub at that time you used to call them franchisee, now the network manager. So in northern part of Bangladesh, so we tried to source potato engaging the farmers hub, and we were very successful in sourcing potatoes. And then after that, for a couple of years, we ran this program. We were very happy seeing the model. And then when we approached Syngenta Foundation, that's what Anita was telling, that you have to have a success story. There was a success story. We picked up that one from there. So we said, how can we develop an alternate market distribution strategy? So we found that when we sell our inputs to farmers, when we try to reach more and more farmers, we need at least what happens in Bangladesh is like we reach the farmers through input dealers or retailers, and all the seed companies, input companies, they go to the same dealer or retailer to sell their products. So we found that we have to have an innovative approach where we can reach the farmers more closely, more directly, and what it could be. Then we found this: if we can take a farmer sub model by ourselves, so what can we do is like we can sell those products to the farmers through the farmers hub. So we found farmers hub model as an excellent model to reach the farmers. And also, it's a bit of, you have the entrepreneurship development thing. You have a dedicated person work for you, not you don't need to pay them. It's not under your payroll, but you have an entrepreneur. If that hub owners become an entrepreneur, which is they are, so that becomes easier for you to manage the network. So they become sustainable by their own, with their own businesses. So that's what we took there, and we started working in the southern part of Bangladesh together with Syngenta Foundation. We developed 200 farmers hub. Unfortunately, we started the program in 2020, full COVID time. So you can understand that, the progress was not that fast. 2021 also, COVID. Basically, we started in full swing from 2022. within to the end of 2023, we managed to achieve 200 farmer sub in southern Bangladesh. It was a little bit hurried. There were some, I mean, definitely all models have their advantage or good sides and bad side disadvantages. So the approach is absolutely great that you can reach more and more small farmers, smallholder farmers through a farmers hub, I mean, entity. So that's easy. That becomes, that's a useful thing for us. And the difficult thing is the time. So when it was a project, so when it was a program, you have to have 100 farmers up within 1 year. Entrepreneurship doesn't happen in that way. So you have to really give time. You have to really screen things. Then what we started, the road shows. We started promoting the concept. Instead of finding the entrepreneur, farmer sub-entrepreneur, we thought that, we should promote the concept among the farmers in the southern Bangladesh. They should have come to us that, okay, we want to become your, franchisee, something like that. Yeah. So that's how we started. And that's a good thing that we achieved the target, the number. And most of the farmers sub are now operating fantastic, very good way. And we are achieving our sales target through those farmers sub. That's a good thing. So, the target that we have set in 2023, we achieved it. First quarter of 24, we also achieved it. And now we are trying to do a different thing. That's what I'm in the country with the country office of Syngenta Bangladesh, Foundation Bangladesh. We are now in discussion how can we diversify, because most of the farmer sub here, is based on nursery, fruit and vegetable nursery. So we said, okay, we want to not only fruits and vegetable nursery, we have to take up more agri products there. It can be many other food items, agricultural things. So what can we do? How can we include more women farmers, women entrepreneurs into the program? So we are in discussion with Syngenta Foundation Bangladesh. So continuously, we are having brainstorming meeting, how best we can, because sustainability of those units, of those farmers hub gives us business. So we say that, in some cases we invest. We have started investing in farmers hub because we set a target that we will have 500 farmers hub by the end of next year. And if we do that, so we will have a wide-reaching network. That's what we need. We don't want to reach the farmers through the retailers, traditional retailers and distributors where everybody is going. We want to create a uniqueness. That's the beauty of the model. So now it's not only the nursery thing. We are now thinking what else we can do there. So we are trying to make some inclusive financing program for the farmers through the hub. We are trying to make some of the farmers up, convert some of the farmers up into food processing unit, because we run a food company, Seba Food Tech Limited, which is the forward market of our input, then we grow the product, and then forward market is, we have set up few good factories there. So we would like to source our raw materials through those farmers hub, and we can engage some of the farmers hub as a primary processor.
So Raj, let me interrupt you there because we need to move on. I just want to pull out a couple of observations and reflections from my side, and thank you very much for explaining the history as well as the current state. I think one thing is this transformational sort of partnership. It evolves. Clearly we've gone through an evolutionary pathway with you, but increasingly, as you were saying towards the end, this is your business leadership driving then the continuing evolution. It's no longer us coming as a development partner. We're there in the background now, helping to guide and advise and provide technical inputs and so on. But it's really your business now that's leading the charge, both on the ongoing expansion as well as the diversification. So I think this is a really strong kind of evidence case of how the mainstreaming is not just about us as an institution, as a development catalyst, but also about having this very successful handoff process and you embedding it then in your business model. So thank you for those inspiring words. Let me shift over now to Mark. And Mark has been sitting as a co-funder with us. We've had a Global Development Alliance partnership with USAID for some years, which is now evolving into a new phase. And Mark, as a funder and as a scaling community of practice leader as well, has been a wonderful partner for us. Mark, what are your reflections, particularly again on the mainstreaming theme rather than the project details?
Well, I'm going to touch on this, Simon, in a maybe a little bit different way than you were anticipating as far as the mainstreaming goes. USAID, so I'm with USAID's Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. I'm in the Center for Agriculture. I lead our scaling team. We first encountered Syngenta Foundation through the Feed the Future initiative, which has been a big, our big initiative in agriculture for the last 15 years almost. We first encountered Syngenta Foundation as in the form of Farm Force, which goes back a long time. So Farm Force back in those days is more about traceability, an early traceability system. We were quite impressed with it. A couple missions in Central America were using that, and then it got sold. The Syngenta Foundation spun it out, and it went private. And we were all wondering, well, that was fast, and we were somewhat left in a lurch. But it was a really interesting example for us and something that we were able to learn from. And that's what I'm going to emphasize right now is more than a scaling partner for USAID, Syngenta Foundation has been a learning partner. And it's been a learning partner in key ways that are going to have, I think, very long-lasting impact inside of our organization and some of our other implementing partners. So in about 2013 or so, we really started talking about what we're going to be able to do in the seed sector together a lot more, along with some other partners in the area. But we retained jointly a consultant, Sarah Boddicker, who some of you may know, to help do a scaling seed study and sort of lay out an action plan of what we can do, how we can do it, and that grew eventually into what has become Seeds to Be. For those of you who don't know Seeds to Be, it's a way that Syngenta Foundation has developed for commercializing and scaling new crop varieties. We were having conversations with, it was Ian Barker at the time at the foundation, and talking about what they were doing, this interesting new thing, Seeds to Be. You know, we've got business to business, business to consumers. Now we have seeds to business or Seeds to Be. And the description was really enticing for us. So at about that point in USAID's journey through Feed the Future and our innovation labs, of which we have many, we had accumulated over 200 new crop varieties. Some of them were getting out into farmers' fields, some of them weren't so much. And we learned from Syngenta Foundation that the Seeds to Be model was doing something similar to a discovery and trials process for private interests. And we challenged them. So is this something do you think you could do with new crop varieties that are more on the public good side, some of the legume crops and sorghum, millet, crops that a lot of times seed companies aren't so interested in. They accepted the challenge. We had a global development alliance. Over that period of time, our 7, 8, or 9 now even innovation labs, crop varieties have gone through the Seeds to Be process, and from there have gotten into farmers' fields much more effectively. They've They've commercialized probably over 100 new crop varieties. Many of them are out of the innovation labs. That was really great for us to see some of those successes based on investments we'd already made in crop research. Along the way, though, we also learned about the process, which was this product lifecycle process that Syngenta Foundation was using for its for stage gating the new varieties and for advancing innovations. Those innovations and other innovations through their system. It became for us a real touchstone into how we might want to consider doing our own approach to research management. We talked to Syngenta Foundation, and as a result of that conversation, we became very interested in this product lifecycle approach, talked to other seed companies, Corteva, Bayer, Monsanto back in the day, and some other players as well. And the upshot of it all is that USAID now has incorporated a product lifecycle approach into our own management of innovations, not just new crop varieties, but innovations writ large. Another thing that happened through the Seeds to Be was this development of this data platform, quick trials. I remember seeing a rudimentary version with Victoria Johnson Chadwick, in fact, I think she might be on, was working on the spreadsheet that was very interesting about how we can collect data, what data we need, how many data points there were going to be. And to think that at that early point, this is now morphed into the quick trials approach, which also a lot of USAID's innovation labs have now begun to use. That was just a real stroke of good fortune for us. And again, we're learning from the foundation. And now we're looking at this gate tool that the foundation has developed, and we see some interesting potential out of that. I think that's enough to convince most people who would be on here that the relationship has been very much a learning one for USAID. I will say that there's one area that we were always trying to make more progress on that we really haven't, and it's been discussed a bit already, is the need to be able to track diffusion and to track diffusion of innovations, track diffusion of what the foundation has been investing in and what USAID invests in much more effectively than what we've been able to in the past. That's probably one of the biggest weaknesses I can point to with the whole concept of scaling in general. But that's hopefully something to still be addressed in the future, and we can, as a community of practice, do a much better job of that. I think there, Simon, hopefully that was succinct enough, and I'll leave it back to you.
Thank you, Mark. No, I really appreciate that. And particularly your comments about the adoption into, the agency's work more broadly than just in the seeds space. I mean, there's kind of scaling the innovations and the system change associated with that, but there's also these kind of institutional evolutions that happen as you go on this scaling journey through the transformational partnerships, and it really is then a kind of reciprocal thing. I've put a couple of links in the relevant to things you mentioned in the chat in case anybody wants to take a look at those. But at this point, I think we should move on to Richard, who may now have some reflections, and we can come back to some of the questions in the chat as well. So Richard, let's bring you back in, and maybe we'll have the full panel at this point. Just put their cameras on if people are okay to do that. For those who are left, I think Anita may have left to join her family.
Great, thank you, Simon, and thank all the panelists, particularly those in India who are interrupting their Diwali. Even though I do want to get back to John Gargani's question, I do want to follow up immediately with what Mark said. It does seem that one of the strengths of what Syngenta has been doing, and you mentioned this, Karen mentioned this, Mark mentioned this, is your work on the enabling environment policy and systems change. And I guess I'd like to follow this up, particularly the seeds to be work, which I would concur has really been a game changer. And I'm glad to hear that at least USAID BREFS has really taken up some of these innovations, such as the stage gating, but also trying, I think, to see if they can, fund gaps to strengthen systems in countries where, those systems are weak or have gaps, because if there isn't a system to scale with, it doesn't matter what the innovation is. So I guess my question to both Simon and Mark, though I'd certainly happy to hear Raj if you'd like to come in on this, is many funders and foundations or donors don't support or don't implement systems change. It's too long term, it's too expensive, it's really hard to measure results. And given the prevailing orthodoxy or practice of 2-3 year project, which reaches 10,000 farmers, shows them some new technology, some no seeds, et cetera, et cetera. What has allowed Syngenta Foundation, and to the extent, Mark, that you've been able to, BREFS, to move forward with funding systems change, implementing systems change, whether it's the seeds to be work, whether it's the stage gating work? I mean, these are pretty big changes. What can other funders or implementers learn from your experiences about trying to fund and support and do this kind of systems change, system strengthening work? Simon, maybe you could go first, and then Mark, and then if Raj or Karen, you'd want to come in on this, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think it comes back to something I said earlier, Richard, which is, having that long-term vision of what scaling is. And I think this partly touches on John's question as well, that scaling is not just more farmers or more entrepreneurs or more seeds sold, or, it's not just a volume game. Yes, of course, we want to see that. We want to see more farmers benefit, more entrepreneurs building vibrant businesses and so on. But it's also about having a system underpinning that supports that to then happen through the market system or with, where it's relevant, government support. And in order to do that, one has to learn continuously. It's not that you have your results framework, you hire your development contractor, and then for 5 years you don't talk to them because they're implementing that thing. It's very much an agile, adaptive management kind of approach, and continuously innovating. And we had a huge advantage of being a corporate-backed foundation. I'll give an update on what's happening to our foundation in a few minutes, but with a highly predictable budget from year to year, and yet a board that understood that this was how we needed to work. So that kind of ability to be an agile, nimble player, holding on to these focused visions of seeds transformation, insurance transformation, last mile business model transformation, and so on, enabled us to be agile and adaptive as we went. Mark, over to you.
Well, from our perspective, I guess it was more of recognizing the fact that some things weren't working. As we watch new crop varieties accumulate and they're not necessarily getting out to where we were hoping they would reach, it became more urgent. And with a sense of urgency comes a recognition that we have to change the systems. The systems aren't working now. We have to do things differently, and then to try to recognize what could that look like and do some experimenting. We worked with Seeds to Be. We tried a few other things, and Seeds to Be was really what was working best. And then pulling in the systems that we could pull into a U.S. government type of constraints that we have, we were able to make the best of that, I think. But the starting point was what was in place wasn't achieving what we needed it to achieve.
Raj, maybe you could come in on this. What do you see as the role of the private sector and local partners, market actors, in strengthening systems? In a sense, you're muted, by the way. You're muted, Raj.
Sorry. So if you see, as I've told you, from the funding point of view, definitely, I mean, Syngenta Foundation assisted us in the beginning years. Now we have taken this project. We are a private, I mean, investors, we are entrepreneurs. So we see whole thing from a different point of view. For us, it's more important how much benefit we are getting. If we see benefit, we'll invest. So we'll seek, I mean, for us, what is external? Definitely technical assistance, technical guidance, everything is needed. But as I've told you that we are investing. We are investing in farmer sub model now. Today, I had a long meeting with a commercial bank where we will, as I've told you, that we're going to launch an inclusive financing program where we would like to include the farmers hub. So we would like to really facilitate funding to the farmers through the hub. So if you see from that point of view, so I mean, we see that the funding, I mean, for us, the funding, if the commercial bank, commercial entities, if they come up with financing those things, and it's not necessarily that, I mean, the technical assistance needs to be paid from the development partners. It can also be paid from the private sector. I mean, so from there. So we provide also technical assistance, and it's embedded with the services. So now when we provide loan to the farmers for buying crops or bundle things, so we will definitely ensure that the financial literacy training, technical guidance, and all these things are given to the farmers. And that is very important because we would like to pay back the loan to the loan to the bank. So for that's why we see the whole thing from a different point of view. What we believe is sustainability. When we are not fully dependent on the farmers hub at this moment, I mean, for distributing our inputs and everything, services, agri-services. But once we have started transforming from there, from dealers, I mean, the regular traditional dealer and retailer network to the farmer sub network. So once we do it, we would like to make sure that this model, this network is fully functioning, and our sustainability depends on their sustainability. That's what we think.
Great, thank you. Karen, before if you have a comment on this, which I'd love to hear, I actually would like, you don't, then I'd like to change the topic just slightly, and a sort of cluster, and I hope I'm not making this too complex, of issues have come up, which is the need for adaptive management and monitoring and evaluation indicators and a learning framework. Now, those have two aspects in my mind. One is sort of an objective aspect, is it working or not? But it also relates to staff incentives, which is how are you being seen as successful? Performance appraisals, for example, there was a question in the chat, do Syngenta staff have metrics or aspects in which they are evaluated, and in which they are evaluated their performance appraisals? How do we balance entrepreneurship and pulling the plug? So I guess, you know, Karen, I'd like to start with you because you sort of have an arm's length perspective here. How does Syngenta try to balance this question of being adaptive and learning and an organizational culture that centers it, and at the same time, how do they measure these entrepreneurship success, especially with things like system change or scaling? This is kind of, it's not so easy, as opposed to, you know, we had a target of reaching 50,000 farmers and we did it, as opposed to we put in place a functioning seed system in Kenya. Do you want to talk, and I think this relates to the issues you raised about sort of portfolio management, you know, with the, you know, which again has more of a tolerance for risk. So do you want to share any of your thoughts given your arm's length perspective? And then Simon, I'd love to hear from you about this.
Wow, that's a hard question that you've thrown at me, but I will give it a shot. I mean, I think what we learned and what we observed is that kind of conventional way of development think of programmatic, need to deliver, you know, inputs, outputs, outcomes, log frame, and then at the end reflection didn't work, and everyone kind of had an allergic reaction to that when we were discussing, you know, what does this actually look like, or other people's prior experience before they came into Syngenta Foundation. So that much rigidity and structure and that kind of logic model and getting tied to it was something that they really wanted to rip up, and they wanted to be able to have space for reflection. So there was a lot around learning and asking questions. And so that, I think, was kind of the switch. But yes, I think people did struggle a little bit, with what do we measure and manage, and people did want to set ambitious targets. And I think, we heard that from Anita in terms of like the numbers, the aspirations, like the counting. But I think there was always a balance in terms of what we were hearing with kind of qualitative. So what does that number mean? What is that, lived experience, the use of 60 decibels as a monitoring, evaluation, and learning tool to get that kind of outcome rich user perspective was a very important piece of it. So those are just kind of a few reactions. I don't think we kind of nailed, and I think we asked a few times, what is this performance metric or kind of way of evaluating looks like. And so, I don't think we ever kind of leveled that out. So you might be able to add on to that, but that was the sense that we got from the interviews.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, Karen, thank you. Yeah, I think, again, there was a sort of maturing once we brought in the portfolio management approach and this kind of annual planning cycle. So once we brought that in, then there were annual targets, but then it was up to the teams to set what those annual targets were as part of their annual plan. And then the team leads, or the sub-portfolio, as we call it, leads, would then cascade that down through their team. So people would have annual targets in terms of outputs, at least, rather than outcomes, perhaps, that they were trying to achieve. And then there would be, as you said, a kind of discussion about, okay, if we overshot or undershot, well, why was that, and so on. And being a corporate foundation, we had a bonus system. So in the annual reviews, then there was a review of how had managers or team members within the managers' teams done against their targets for the year. But it wasn't necessarily a linear thing. Like if you overshot your target by 10%, you get a 10% higher bonus or something like that. It was much more of a trigger for discussion about learning and adaptation then into the plans for the next year. But certainly people who were performing extremely well would get a higher bonus, and people who were underperforming would get a lower one, or even would be exited from the foundation at certain points. So it was used as a people management tool. Now, Richard, you also asked the question. That's easier when it's like, well, it's this number of farmers' hubs and this volume of seeds, and so on. It's harder when it gets to the policy piece or the more systemic shift pieces that we were trying to unlock. And there it was more about, have we seen some signs of adoption of policy recommendations, for example, or policy guidance or institutional strengthening or not, was more kind of the approach. But again, we didn't get as far yet as I would have liked on that piece. I think it still needs more work.
Simon, if I could follow up, the Syngenta Foundation has about 25 headquarters staff and about 150, so maybe 175, 200. I think USAID, and I'm not going to pick on USAID, has 10,000. It reports to the U.S. Congress and to the President and to the Secretary of State. And I think it's true of most official donors. They have a lot of bureaucratic administrative rules, which is what's favored the project model. You're a nimble, small foundation. What can you say? But you've also worked for Technoserve, which got a lot of, USAID contracts, as well as obviously the funding that you and Mark were talking about from Seeds to Be. Since you kind of straddle both camps, what would be your hope or advice or insights from your experience, such as the portfolio management? I don't think, let's not pick on USAID. The World Bank and IFAD, which both work heavily in agriculture, claim that about 80% of their projects are at least moderately successful. It's hard to believe that's a portfolio approach or a high risk approach. And you guys could take more risks. What lessons from your experience in terms of mainstreaming scaling, of taking on this portfolio approach, of emphasizing systems, of being more flexible in your adaptive learning, as opposed to here's a 3 to 5 year contract, deliver on these outcomes, could you say to official donors who tend to have a very heavy influence on what gets done in international development and agri-food systems in particular?
Yeah, gosh, Richard, that's a a whole essay just to be written on in answering that question.
Well,
but
maybe you should post one on Syngenta Foundation's website. Or we'd be happy to repost it on the
yeah,
community
exactly.
practice.
We should continue after the webinar on that. But I think a couple of things. I mean, one thing is I think, taking this kind of system lens as the framing then for the product life cycle or the stage gating kind of approach, and then recognizing internally within even, a USAID or, an IFAD or whatever that agency is, which stage are you at? Are you supporting work that's at this stage or that stage? How are you framing in your journey and your systemic shift that you're trying to see where you're at right now? What is the current state? Number one. Number two is then what is going to be success to get you to the next stage? And then do you want to frame your particular project that you are now going to fund as within that particular stage gate or product lifecycle stage, or maybe 2 stages? And then making sure that you're not just then waving your hands and saying, right, well, we did that, on to the next agenda, that you're having colleagues internally who are going to then pick up the next step. So having that discussion internally before you even start that project to say, right, maybe this is something, that Mark and team in headquarters in DC is supporting, but the next step then is that the country missions are picking this up, having the discussion with the country missions to make sure that they're ready to receive, let's say, this proof of concept that's now been validated through this project. And doing that in advance, not, doing the project and then hoping for the best afterwards. It requires more interagency and internal agency kind of conversations and alignment around then what is being scaled and what is that sort of stage gate process. And then you bring in the portfolio management, hopefully, as a way of then validating that and putting it into a whole institutional infrastructure. So that's just some immediate thoughts about that. But Mark, maybe you want to comment about how realistic what I said would be within an agency context.
Yeah, and Mark, actually, Mark, before you go, let me just say, Mark and his team is working on a case study of some of the things he's mentioned in terms of how USAID's Bureau of Resilience, Environment, and Food Security have tried to start to integrate scaling in their journey over the last 10 years or so. So Mark, I hope we might have a study and a webinar with you sometime maybe in early 2025, so no pressure, a few months out. But both could you respond if you wish to the questions I've raised, Simon's point, and maybe even give a little foreshadowing of what we might expect from your study in the future?
Yeah, I think I'll just speak to the question more directly than venture off into the future. So right now, I would say USAID is, at least our bureau is in a place where, we've been able to do some experimentation, but we've done it with partners who have shown a way how to do experimentation, and we're out in the lead in some instances, but it's much easier as a public sector to be able to follow another organization that's done more pioneering, and that way we're not going to get accused of frittering away taxpayers' money, which is something we do have to be concerned about. So having a pioneer we can lean on and learn from, and then join with in a partnership is a much better way for us to proceed, whether I'm talking about here in Washington or even a mission, one of our missions in whatever country. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Mark. That was really great. Well, actually, we only have a few minutes left, and Simon, I guess I want to sort of give you the last word before I wrap up, which is on a few topics. First of all, do you have anything else you want to say about John Gargani's question about how you define scaling, and particularly the issue of transformational versus transactional scaling? And secondly, I don't want to spoil your surprise, but unfortunately, I'm under the impression that the Syngenta Foundation is going to be phasing out its work by the end of this year. And if you'd also like to say a few words about how you see the foundation going forward, I gather you're spinning off some of the individual country efforts. Last words, we've only got 6 minutes, so if you could leave me 2 or 3 minutes, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I'll be brief. So John's question is great. I hope I already touched on that, but essentially what we mean by scaling is we very much, and to Johannes's point, our focus has been on scaling of innovations. And those innovations could be products like seeds, but they could also be business models like the first mile agri or last mile agri entrepreneurs kind of model. So it's a range of things, but it's kind of a thing that we're scaling. But in order to really scale to have as much impact as possible, at some point you get into the system change, because you really want to see underserved rural communities become served. You want to see farmers who are vulnerable to climate risks, who are not using modern technologies and modern practices, to be using those modern technologies and modern practices, and to be served where possible through market systems. So to John's question about what impacts don't scale through markets, I think, John, for us, maybe the capacity building piece is hardest to scale through market systems, although I was really pleased, Raj, to hear you say that your business is even funding some of the technical assistance. This is not even beyond the bounds of what an innovative and dynamic private organization like yours can take on. So I think from our perspective, even though it may require catalytic subsidies at different stages of that innovation cycle, and we can take agricultural insurance as a particular topic there, which, by the way, anywhere in the world is subsidized except Australia, and look at the average size of farms in Australia, and you can understand why maybe Australia can get away without subsidizing agricultural insurance. So there is a role for the public sector as you scale towards system change, that's for sure. But at the end of the day, yes, we want to see system strengthening happening, and the livelihood and environmental and nutritional and so on outcomes being achieved, and that's the objective of the scaling work. I think, Richard, just on your update about the foundation, just very briefly, so we are closing our foundation in Switzerland this year. In fact, at the end of next month, we will no longer have any staff active, but we have successfully spun out most of our country initiatives, especially in India and Bangladesh and Kenya as a hub for sub-Saharan Africa. They will be operating as a connected network in the future of nonprofits, and they will be taking this agenda forward. Whether they will, continue on exactly the pursuit and the strategy we've been on or not, of course, is then up to them. But so far, that seems to be the approach they're taking, and they've made great progress this year in mobilizing additional partnerships. So the restructuring that's had to happen in those 3 countries has been fairly minimal in terms of staff. We've had to downsize more significantly in the spin-offs in Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, and Indonesia, which didn't have as much co-funding and as strong partnerships as the other 3, but they're all also going to be continuing forward. And I'm very excited to see this legacy network of our Asian and African operations now operating in leading their own futures rather than responding to the leadership from Switzerland. So I think this is a narrative and a time for this, which is actually, by the way, very relevant to USAID's agenda, as well as many other funders who now want to see more dynamic local organizations emerging after many decades of development work. So back to you with 2 minutes left, Richard.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you, Simon, and Karen, for writing a brilliant, Karen, and you and your partner for writing a wonderful case study. I really urge people to get on the website and read it. It's short, it's punchy, it's very I think, perspicacious, if I can use a $5 word here, and taking the time, Raj, for participating, and of course, Mark, everything you've done. I guess I have a few conclusions. I really think that what we learned from the Syngenta case is the importance of strong leadership. And I'm not saying this to flatter you, Simon, but you know, maybe that's easily more effective in a small organization, but you really put this front and center. And I know it wasn't easy. You know, you inherited a staff. A lot of people didn't understand what you were doing. I was there. I was part of it. You had a lot of naysayers, and you brought along both the team, the board, and 3 or 4 country teams. I think the other things that got highlighted was the interaction between adaptive management and learning and monitoring and evaluation, and how critical monitoring and evaluation is on multiple fronts. Both, is it working, both proof of concept, but especially for systems change, you know, that's harder to do, but also for staff incentives and staff feedbacks. You know, I mean, staff respond to, you know, am I doing well? Is it working? And the ability to do that. And that really was a change in organizational culture. And I think I'm going to end with the last point, which is basically to repeat what Mark said, which is, I think it's just unambiguously true that foundations have more flexibility to try things, to take risks, and to fail, that official donors don't. And I think that's the role they need to play. And I think one of the things we're going to try to push in mainstreaming scaling is partnerships between foundations and official donors, which is, we try 10 things. Yeah, half of them didn't work, but these other things really are working, but we don't have the kind of resources that a USAID has, or a World Bank, or an EFAD. Can you pick this up and run with it and really take it to scale? And I think the partnership between Syngenta Foundation and USAID and the seeds to be and some of the systems change work is really quite brilliant. And I think it's one of the reasons that we're doubling down on this coming year of case studies, and to look at what foundations are doing and how they can feed into, as well as take the lead, obviously, in change. I mean, obviously, the Gates Foundation doesn't need USAID to do things for it. They have a lot of resources too. And so with that, I just want to foreshadow that we will have another mainstreaming webinar in a few weeks, which is going to be with Catholic Relief Services. They've done a very interesting effort, which is to, they had a sort of a whole separate effort on scaling, which they piloted in a number of places and countries and sectors. And now they're trying to mainstream that into the heart of the organization. And we'll be able to hear that in, I think, a couple weeks. So, and also we will be having an event for the Society of International Development on December 3rd. That'll be an in-person. I don't know whether we'll be able to stream that as well, on mainstreaming scaling, and some of these papers will be presented. And we hope to particularly have some of our friends at USAID there as well. So thank you, Simon, for all the work you've done and for the case study and supporting Karen and her team and doing the case study. And Raj for being part of the Syngenta team and this webinar. And of course, Mark, for everything you've done for well over a decade in this. For those of you who are on the inside, I think the people who work in USAID are walk on water, because they put up with a lot of difficult bureaucratic stuff, and yet they keep chugging the changes of administration, bureaucracy. So Mark, my hat's off particularly to you and your colleagues. You guys really do the hard labor. So thank all of you, and thanks to those of you who stayed on the call, and we look forward, I hope, to seeing you in a couple of weeks.